All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for the 14th edition of the Fireside Chat. My name is Garrett McLaughlin. For those of you who are new to this series, the Fireside Chat is a conversational webinar where we connect with some of the top professionals in the running, health, and medical community. This week, we have Matt Ferlindes, who is a physical therapist and triathlon coach in Franklin, Wisconsin. Before we get started, let me cover a few quick housekeeping items. First, do us a favor and silence any technology around you. We want to make sure and try to limit distractions and get as much as possible from the chat today. Second, I highly recommend asking questions. Of course, there'll be specific items we cover as was outlined in the registration, but you're welcome to ask anything that will help you positively impact your running form and performance. So feel free to drop a question in the chat box now or at any point throughout the chat if something comes to mind. Lastly, if you cannot stay for the entire chat for whatever reason, or you just want to reflect back on this content at a later time, I will be sending the replay of this to you tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure to check your email and especially the spam folder since it can sometimes end up in there. Without further ado, Matt, thanks for joining us on the Fireside Chat. How's your week going so far?
It has been going really, really well overall. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be able to share some good information around running. So I'm excited.
Yeah, we appreciate you joining us today. And I know only kind of one piece of what you do here, but I think if we could start by just giving everyone a simple introduction on you, who you are, where you're from, and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Matt. I am a physical therapist and I work in the Milwaukee area, kind of in the Franklin suburb, but I am a physical therapist that specializes specifically in treating runners and more sports medicine. I'm a board certified sports therapist, which is just essentially a fancy thing for getting a little bit more education in the sports realm and taking a nice big long board exam, which was always a blast. I'm also certified through USA Triathlon as a triathlon coach. So I'm a very avid runner and triathlete myself. So um, it's always been a goal of mine to be able to have my own business and have my own clinic where I can really devote to runners and share my passion with others and allow other people to kind of get back to running healthy and things of that nature. So I'm excited to share some good information with you all today.
Yeah, awesome. I think we have a few people from the Wisconsin, Milwaukee area on here right now. So hopefully they can check you out and hopefully reach out
Sure.
if they need anything. But so before we get into the weeds a little bit in specific areas as it relates to running form, I'm just curious on what is your current like interpretation of what is good running form? I guess in a general sense, what is your belief behind that as you look at your personal, professional, and also reflect on the research? Is there such thing as good running form?
Great question. It's a very loaded question. And ultimately, with all of my experience in this realm, I've kind of come down to the fact that no, there is no like perfect running form per se. There's a lot of people and there's a lot of information out there where they say, oh, this is the best way to run. Oh, this is the best way to run. And that's where I've kind of wanted to delve into the research in this area to figure out, okay, like who's telling me the truth? And what's truthful, what's actually not truthful, just because I feel like runners especially get so much thrown at them in terms of knowledge and from different coaches and clinicians and running stores and runners themselves, and a lot of that information is just like passed down time after time after time again, and a lot of times there's no like actual research backing it at all. And so when things get repeated over and over and over again, sometimes it starts to sound true and we just kind of hold it onto it as a truth. And so there's things that are more ideal with running, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But to say that this is the perfect way to run, this is how you should run, no, I don't believe that there is that clear cut of an answer related to that topic.
Okay. That's good to know. And so as we dive into the details here a little bit, I guess we'll start at the first thing you hear about is if I can change the slide here is foot strike. So and I know I've been in a few different places over the years, good form running clinics, a lot of people that recommend that midfoot strike pattern that's better for runners. It's less likely to create injuries and improves performance. What's your thought as it relates to foot strike pattern?
Really good question. So back in the probably early mid, like 2007, 2008, 2009, I was on high school cross country. I was on our team. And our coaches were very excited about us all adopting a forefoot strike. And so when we talk about the different heel strikes, I have a shoe just to be able to like demonstrate them. Otherwise, I use my hand and it gets a little confusing. So like if we take a shoe and we look at like a heel strike, that's where we're landing with our heel first, obviously. If we think about a toe strike or a forefoot strike, that's kind of where the foot comes down and we land on the toes first. Midfoot is where that foot comes down and lands perfectly even right here. And so I remember in cross country, because all of our coaches were like, don't heel strike. It's really bad for you. It's really horrible for you. They even showed us this horrible video that's still stuck in my mind to this day of this runner's foot coming down and hitting on their heel. And as soon as they hit on their heel, there was a sound of breaking glass that was just horrible. And it just like scared us all to start running on our toes. And what resulted for me was 2 years of Achilles tendonitis that was not really fun to deal with because I wasn't adapted to that heel strike overall. And so when we actually delve into the research and actually look at it, it really doesn't matter if you are a heel striker, if you are a midfoot striker, if you are a forefoot striker. They all have pros and cons of each of them. And we found that there isn't like a foot strike doesn't even have an effect on running economy and overall running form. So one necessarily isn't really efficient to any other ones. And these pictures that are up here. So I am an overall triathlon nerd, running nerd. And so over this summer, the professional triathletes came to Milwaukee to perform in the PTO US Open in Milwaukee in early August. So I follow triathlon to a T. It's one of my favorite sports to watch. And so me being the PT that I am and the running nerd that I am, I put my phone on like slow motion and I took videos of all the runners passing by. And then I like literally analyzed their foot strike. So all of these are essentially like when their foot lands perfectly on the ground. And you can see the one on the left and the one on the right, that's a pretty clear heel strike. They are landing completely on their heel, toes are up. That's, very obviously a heel strike. The person in the middle, I was actually kind of crazy shocked by because that was like the perfect like midfoot landing. I stopped that frame right when the foot landed, and as you can see, that foot's totally flat. So it's like a perfect midfoot landing. Now, I like to show this picture because, again, a lot of people are like, oh, heel striking is horrible. Heel striking is not efficient. Well, the picture on the right is actually of Taylor Knibb, and Taylor Knibb is going to be representing USA in the triathlon in the Olympics next year. And she absolutely dominated that race. And so if she's heel striking, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily going to be slowing us down or anything like that. So I really like to show this picture because like that's who's representing, that's the fastest of the fast in triathlon right now. And she's got a very clear heel strike. And so it just kind of shows anecdotally, of course, that it really doesn't necessarily matter if you do heel strike or forefoot strike at all.
Yeah, that's good to know. And so one thing I'm always curious about, and it will relate to all of these things we talk about, if we can see on that right picture there, that person's wearing some kind of KT tape on the wheels outside of the leg there. What is your thought on running form, running mechanics as it relates to a pain-free runner, and then comparing that to a runner that's currently suffering from, if this person's suffering from an injury, would you then consider, all right, maybe you want to change things temporarily to reduce or mitigate pain? Or do you think in all situations, you kind of run how you run and just do what you just continue to do what you're doing?
Really good question. So especially as a clinician myself, it's always my goal to keep runners running. It's very rare that we have an injury that we completely need to stop running. That would be like bone stress injuries, fractures, things of that nature. We need to completely offload. But a lot of different injuries, like maybe some chronic knee pain, tendinopathies, we can usually continue to run through. And so, yes, ultimately, if a person comes into me with no pain, I don't like to change their running form just because that's how they run. However, if somebody's coming in with pain and there's a very clear, obvious reason why that pain is there based off their running form, sometimes we will tweak things a little bit here and there. And ultimately, we know from like a lot of research that people that land on their heels ultimately have an increased like loading rate through their tibia and through their lower leg. People that land on their forefoot have a decreased loading rate. However, we kind of get an exchange off where people that land on their forefoot have a really high level of calf activation and eccentric calf activation, and just a lot of activation through the Achilles and a lot of force through the Achilles, whereas heel strikers don't have that as much. And so what that essentially means is heel strikers are going to be more commonly at risk for like more knee injuries, things of that nature, versus forefoot strikers can be more at risk for like Achilles tendinopathy, ankle injuries. And so when we kind of look at it, once again, they both have their different pros and cons. However, the biggest thing to really watch out for, and I think where a lot of injuries do stem from sometimes, is when people really overstride. So they're putting their foot way out there, and that's something that I will try to change with everyone. But you can see in the picture on the right, Taylor Knibb, like even though she's hitting with her heel, her tibia is still pretty vertical. And so she's not like really hardcore putting that foot way out there, which is a really, really good thing. That means it's more of an efficient way to go about it. That's probably the biggest thing. If I see a heel strike with like that knee fully extended out in front and causing all sorts of force and break, that would be a sign of like, okay, we need to bring that foot in a little bit and get a little bit more shock absorption through there.
Yeah, because when you look at these three pictures as well, like the one in the middle, that foot is more so under the body. The one on the right's a little bit more in front, still vertical. The one on the left is even more in front. So that's kind of what reminds me of when you said through cross country and track there, to hear the glass shattering. To me, that as opposed to heel striking, that foot really landing in front, it seems like there'd be more force into that leg, if that's correct.
Yeah, 100%. And we know that from research for a fact that when that foot is out there, there's a lot more braking force. So you're actually slowing yourself down and then speeding yourself back up. And based off these pictures, definitely the one on the left has that more overstriding gait. And again, that could be for a number of things. We're catching them at one instance, so it could be a little bit too fatigued because of that. But again, she's also a professional triathlete, so it's kind of crazy that she's gotten this far with that type of gait. But it would be interesting to see if she just works on that just a little bit, if she develops better running form and just better overall efficiency. But that's the one thing that I am like really hesitant about. If someone is really overstriding, that is probably the biggest running form flaw that I look for. Everything else is pretty doable to run with and really isn't going to be that detrimental.
Right, right. And do you ever consider that maybe it's the cameraman here at this USA Triathlon?
That's a great question. It definitely could be me. I did my best. Obviously, I don't have all the fancy equipment, but I thought it was just a fun little mini experiment for sure.
Yeah, pretty cool. And this was probably what, down Veterans Park somewhere in Milwaukee, if it.
Yeah, it was exactly Veterans Park. Yep.
That's awesome. Yeah, great place to run.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Mhm.
let's dig into now. I guess we talk about overpronation and hip drop. If this picture could possibly look at both of those things with that posterior view. So
Yeah.
overpronation, and I mean something huge when, especially as you go into local running stores these days, we're looking at different kinds of shoes, neutral, motion control, stability, and really looking at the stability of the foot. And then you see a picture like this, and be honest with you, most people probably cringe looking at that. So I'd love for you to dig into this a little bit more and tell us your thoughts on pronation and overpronation.
Yeah, I love this picture because it cracks me up because so many people would cringe at this picture. But this picture is actually of another professional triathlete. His name is Patrick Lang. He is a two-time Ironman world champion. I want to say two or three time. I think two. But this was actually during the Challenge Roth race back in June this year. And during this race, he set a Ironman distance record for the marathon time. He ran a 2 hour, 30-minute, 27-second marathon, which was a record for an Ironman distance triathlon with this running form right here, which is just kind of crazy to think about because a lot of people would cringe at that and would, try to fix that. And if he went into a running shoe store and got on a treadmill, most people would probably put him in some sort of a stability shoe to try to correct that a little bit. But he is one of the fastest runners in triathlon right now, long distance wise. And so it begs the question of like, is overpronation really wrong? And I read a really interesting article about a month ago, which kind of restirred my passion to kind of delve into the research around this. But for so long, we've been kind of taught that the foot needs to pronate when we land on it a little bit. And then it becomes like rigid. The foot becomes really, really rigid in order to allow us to like fully step off of it. And what this review article was kind of looking at, it was looking at a lot of the research that we got those conclusions from was flawed in various different ways. And what we're actually starting to learn is that the foot is actually supposed to be mobile. The foot is supposed to move more than we originally thought that it should. And so there were really two interesting quotes from that article that I wanted to share. One quote was essentially, it said, quote, "Foot pronation is a naturally occurring foot movement and cannot be linked consistently to injuries." And this was by Belling et al. In 2023. And so that quote is kind of remarkable because for so long we've been taught overpronation can lead to foot injuries and can lead to knee injuries, hip injuries, back injuries, all of this type of thing. But there is actually no research that links overpronation to those types of injuries. And instead, it's telling us that pronation is more of a natural movement of the foot. The foot should be moving this way a little bit.
Mhm.
And then the other quote was, quote, "People with greater foot pronation and flatter feet actually stored and returned more energy via the spring-like function," end quote. And
Mm.
so now it's kind of essentially saying that pronation is actually helping us be a little bit more efficient at running. And you can see from this picture of Patrick Lange, his foot's obviously coming inwards, but essentially that's kind of acting as a little bit of a spring for him. That foot's coming inwards and he's absorbing that energy. And then when he comes out of that, he is going to be releasing that energy, and that's going to help propel him forward. If we were to put him in a stability shoe, odds are that probably wouldn't run as fast because he's not able to actually use that spring force, and he's not actually able to use that momentum he's gaining from getting some of that overpronation. And so this is kind of reframing our mindset a little bit in terms of we should allow the foot to move and we should allow it to do what it needs to do and do what it wants to do. Um, just because I think that it's important to not limit our body as much, because then we're going to be not using our muscles and not using our joints. And really, the foot's a very complex structure. And so we need to use that movement and use that force and all that good stuff with it.
Yeah. And so I guess question then is when it comes to shoes, is there a certain person that you would say is a better fit for a stability shoe? Is that better if in the instance of pain, we want to keep someone out of this position that's provoking their pain, but as soon as they're pain free, get them back to a neutral shoe where they can really use that foot to its fullest extent? Or so I'm always curious because it's such a big industry now, and recommending specific types of shoes.
It is a very, very huge industry, and it's very interesting. And so, yes, I think there is a role for it if someone is dealing with pain around the foot. One thing that I found in my practice is, of course, I've seen a lot of individuals with pain on the inside of their ankle, and it's kind of on the point of when we overpronate, there's some muscles in there that are helping to bring that arch back up and bring that foot back up. And one of the muscles is called like the tibialis posterior muscle, and it connects from the calf down into the foot, and it's kind of essentially controlling this movement here. And so if that tissue is inflamed and irritated, then we know that what it's having to do, or the external load that's applied to it, is far exceeding what it's capable of. And sometime in the short term, providing somebody with an insole or a stability shoe or something of that nature um, might be beneficial for them, just to calm that tissue down while we're trying to rebuild that back up.
Mhm.
And that's where it depends so much on the person and the injury that's going on and the pain that they're dealing with, because some people definitely would benefit from having just a little bit more support just to get some tissues to calm down. But the other thing is many people without any pain at all go into these running shoe stores and get thrown into stability shoes because they have some overpronation, but they absolutely have no pain at all. And in those situations, I don't think that's necessarily needed. And I think it's always advisable to try to get back to more of a neutral shoe or a shoe that just feels good for you as soon as we can, as soon as we get those tissues to calm down.
You got it. That makes sense. And so as you talk about hip drop, and I know we had a foot picture, which I probably should have popped up there a second ago to show how detailed
Mhm.
the foot is.
Yeah,
On this
I
slide
like
there.
I like this picture because it shows how many muscles are actually in the foot. There's a total of 29 muscles that either connect down into the foot or within the foot themselves. And so once again, when we go back to talking about allowing the foot to move like a foot, if there's so many muscles in the foot and so many bones and so many joints, it only makes sense that the foot should be moving in some way. We don't really have muscles anywhere that movement, doesn't happen. And so if there's these muscles in the foot and everything, there probably should be some movement involved with it.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because we always think of and we always generalize the foot and the bottom of the foot. The plantar fascia is on the bottom of the foot and don't realize like, man, there's a whole other world deep down there in terms of these smaller intrinsic muscles.
Very, very deep. And yeah, it's kind of intense. And all you have to do is really stand on one foot on like uneven surface for a decent amount of time. You'll start to feel a burn in the arch and in your foot. And that's these muscles really trying to provide that stability to you. So they're definitely there, but I think, like you said, they're often forgot about a little bit.
I think so too. And so as we shift gears a little bit here to knee and hip osteoarthritis, and I'm seeing a lot more people post about this and I have a lot of clients as well talk about, oh, I have some arthritis in my knees. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be running or how my body will respond to that. What does the current research tell us in terms of knee osteoarthritis, and is running a smart thing, or will that further exacerbate this issue?
Good question. So there is absolutely no research right now that links running to knee or hip osteoarthritis, which is awesome. It's amazing for all runners because this commonly gets thrown around so much. I've been a PT for about 6 years now, and I can't even count the number of times that I've told individuals that I run, and I do a lot of running myself, and I can't count the number of people that are like, "Oh, don't hurt your knees," or "You're gonna wear out your knees," or "You're gonna need a knee replacement one day." And usually, the commonality of all those people telling me that are number one, they're seeing me for knee pain, so they have knee pain, and number two, they have had a long history of being sedentary and not moving. But there's a lot of research that absolutely does not link knee osteoarthritis to running at all. And this specific article I like to pull up, but it shows an incidence of essentially knee osteoarthritis. And they took a huge sample of individuals, and it said recreational runners, 3.5% of those runners had knee osteoarthritis versus 10.2% of non runners had knee osteoarthritis. So we see that there's a pretty big difference, and actually, runners had less knee osteoarthritis. Now, the one thing I want to mention is this has competitive runners at 13.3%. This was a smaller sample in that study, but these were specifically individuals that were competing on an international and professional level. And so they weren't the run of the mill runners competing at marathons or triathlons. These were people competing best of the best, international, Olympics, that type of thing. So it's a very small subset of people that fall into that 13.3% category. There was even another study that also showed, I have the statistics here, that showed people in a running group had 8.8% of incidence of knee and hip osteoarthritis versus 17.9% of the regular population.
Wow.
And I really like this study. This was by Ponzio et al., but it didn't have a cool infographic like this one does. But in the running group, the average number of people, and I think it was like some 600 people in that running group, on average, those people had competed in 76 marathons throughout their whole life. And so these are people that have run a lot throughout their entire life, completing 76 like that's a lot of marathons to complete. And that was the average. And so if that whole group had only an 8.8% incidence compared to 17.9% incidence in the regular population, like it really doesn't show that running has any effect on the arthritis. And really what that study came down to was like 3 risk factors. Number one was age. Of course, older individuals tend to have a higher risk for arthritis. Number two is family history. So individuals that have had, siblings, parents that have had osteoarthritis are usually at a greater risk for it, and surgical history. So individuals that have had a complex history of knee surgeries and things like that are just at a higher risk factor for it. And those were really the only 3 risk factors that they found in the study, and running had nothing to do with it.
Oh, interesting. It's almost interesting too when you look at these. The extremes seem to have more arthritis than, I guess, that middle group of recreational runners, which I always think about quite a bit myself. As you compare people running different distances, how long they're running, how many races, which might not be exactly true, but it seems like, yeah, it's interesting to see non-runners and competitive runners kind of relatively in that same category, and the recreational
Mhm.
runners being much lower.
Yeah, and honestly, I think what it's kind of showing too is, obviously there's no link between running and arthritis like we often think, but running can also be a little bit protective of the joints too, because we're getting motion, we're getting loading to those joints, and the body's going to adapt and respond to that. And if we are getting higher loading into our knees, into our hips, the structures in those joints are going to respond by getting stronger. And sometimes that can mean that those joints are more resilient to future injuries and more wear and tear and things of that nature too. So individuals that are more sedentary, they're still adapting, but their knees and hips don't have that force to adapt to. And so instead, those tissues are going to de-adapt essentially and get weaker. And that can pose a greater risk for getting more arthritis.
Yeah, so interesting. That stuff, and I think goes against what a lot of people think in terms of arthritis. You
Hmm.
hear from a lot of times, I hear a lot of runners come in, they saw their doctor, and the doctor said a lot of times, but I mean, this kind of goes against uh, their advice almost very, very specifically, which I find interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the one thing that really kind of gets me fired up is when, doctors start to say this thing. And it just kind of goes to show that if you are a runner, like really try to seek your care from people that specialize in more sports and more running or more in depth into there. Because I've even worked with other physical therapists that have had those same beliefs about running. And a lot of times it's, primary care doctors that, don't get me wrong, we need primary care doctors because they can do a lot of things that I can't, and they can screen for a lot of things that I really can't screen for. But sometimes those individuals don't have the same level of knowledge in terms of sports medicine and running and orthopedics and things of that nature. And so flooding yourselves and really advocating for yourself to get those providers and clinicians that specialize more or know more about it, I think is really, really important so they can understand where you're coming from and that you can also kind of connect better with them too.
I love that. And so I guess perfect segue too. Before we get into the Q&A, would love to give you the opportunity. I mean, anyone on this chat, questions for you specifically, want to reach out in Milwaukee, Franklin area that wants to work with you directly, but give us an idea of I guess your capacity as a PT. What are some of the things you're doing on a regular basis, and how can you help people?
Yeah, great question. So my clinic's called Bioendurance PT and Performance. I run a fee-for-service clinic, so I don't go through insurance, and I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one is I can provide a lot more individualized care, so I can really spend as much time as needed with individuals, which is really, really nice. And number two, insurance puts a lot of rules around kind of what we can treat and what we can't treat. And so for runners that are trying to get back to a really high level, a lot of times insurance isn't going to necessarily pay to get back to running or things like that. So that's why I chose to go more of a fee for service type of model. But I provide physical therapy services for individuals who are dealing with injuries or having a hard time running, different things of that nature. For individuals that are pain free or just have an interest or interesting history of past injuries, I do also do an in-depth running analysis. And it sounds funny to say that after we've had this discussion of like running form isn't necessarily the most important thing. But the reason I say in depth is because we spend a good solid 40, 45 minutes before we even get on a treadmill. And essentially what we look at is mobility, we look at strength, we look at functional movements, we look at plyometrics and ability to transmit and attenuate forces and things of that nature, because I think a lot of that plays a big role in risks of running injury and all of that. And so we do all that really before we even get you on the treadmill. But I also do some dry needling as well, which I find really nice of just trying to calm down some tissues that might be inflamed. And I'm also a triathlon coach. So I primarily do more triathlon coaching, and I have some really good contacts that do more specific run coaching, but I really like to kind of specialize more in like specific triathlon type coaching. So yeah, those are really the services that I provide. I do have an Instagram that I try to post a lot of information on, exercises, things of that nature. But yeah, you can see my email and website up there as well if any questions pop up, or if anyone feels a need to reach out to ask any questions or anything of that nature.
Awesome. And so I'll get us started in the Q&A. If anyone else has any questions here, I know we're right at time, but if you want to hang out for a couple minutes, I'm going to get started on 2 questions that were asked in the registration. And if you have a specific question you want to throw into the chat right now, add it in and I'll ask Matt directly. So first question, a hard one to answer, but I guess maybe on your philosophy or some principles that guide what you do, how to run pain-free long-term. So I know that you can go any direction with that, but are there key principles that you believe in as a practitioner in triathlete that you think lay that foundation for healthy and sustainable running?
Great question. I really like that question. And yeah, it is kind of a complex answer, but when we kind of boil it down, it kind of comes down to a very simple principle. So like when we run, every step that we take has a certain amount of load that goes onto our bodies. And so that load kind of accumulates as we run. So longer runs, it's a lot more load than shorter runs, of course. We're more sore after we run 10 miles versus 2 miles, of course. And load interacts with capacity, and capacity is kind of our internal tolerance. So it's what our muscles can tolerate, it's what our joints can tolerate, it's all of those things. And that's essentially why we need to start running slowly when we do run. Because if we haven't run at all, and let's just say, exaggerate, and let's just say we just go out for a 10-mile run, our muscles and joints don't have the capacity for that. So we're going to be really sore, really irritated. But if we start slow, 1 mile is going to feel okay. And then we bump up to 2, 3, 4, just things of that nature. And so running pain-free long-term really boils down to that equation of keeping capacity above load, because we don't want load to go higher than capacity, because that's where injuries can happen. We want to keep our capacity higher. And the question comes down to how can we do that? And a lot of different things go into it. Number one is going to be recovery. We can't always push week after week after week. We have to allow our body to rest and kind of adapt to the stressors we're putting on ourselves. And so this can come in a number of ways: resting in between runs, getting really good sleep. Sleep is so important for proper recovery, as well as making sure that in our training plans, we're taking rest weeks and we're taking some rest time throughout the off season, and even in build up to races. Like every 4th week should really be a deloading week to just recover and kind of accumulate. Nutrition is really important as well. There's some really interesting research out there that if we just miss daily caloric intake by about 350 calories, our bones can actually start to resorb themselves a little bit. And 350 calories really isn't that much. And so getting the proper nutrition, make sure that we're fueling ourselves appropriately for the tasks that we're doing, is really important to keep our body strong and stable. And then 2 other things are really important. Number 1 is strength training, because that's how we're going to build strength, and that is how we're going to make sure our muscles and joints increase their capacity and keep that capacity really high. And number 2, I think is really important, is doing plyometrics and or jump training. And a lot of runners don't typically do this because we don't really think of running as necessary to like develop power and jump. But really, when it comes down to it, we only have one foot on the ground at a time. And every single step, it's almost like we're jumping from one foot to another, to another, to another. So once again, training our bodies to accept those forces is really going to help to increase the capacity of our tendons, our muscles, our joints, all of those types of things. So I think those can really go a long way to making sure that we run pain-free as long as possible. I know it's kind of a long question, but I hope that kind of makes sense a little bit and kind of distilled down as much as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. I know you can go so many different directions with that, and there's so many pieces to it, but those are
Mm-hmm.
good principles there to take home. And also, Sandy asked how to maintain good running form at the end of a run. Are there certain clues you need to look for in terms of your running form breaking down, or a certain way to respond in that run if you feel like you're breaking down?
Yeah. So honestly, number one, it's normal for that to happen because that means we're just simply overloading our bodies a little bit, which it can sometimes be a good thing because that's how we get stronger and whatnot. The other thing that it goes down to is, using whatever cues work best for individuals. For me, I have always had like a lower cadence or steps per minute. And that's something that I work on. Like when I get tired or fatigued, I can improve my running form by focusing on taking quicker steps and getting more of a knee drive. I know for some people, it's standing up a little taller or maybe inclining at their ankles or bringing their head up, whatever it may be. Um, Kind of using those individual cues to really, really help. And the other thing that it comes down to is training and volume. The more that we train and the more that we run, the more our body is going to adapt to those types of things. And so, depending on what type of race you're running and what distances you're running, just trying to adapt to that distance, just so that on race day, when you're running that distance, that fatigue doesn't play as big of a role.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you need to push into that to a degree. The only way to get better at it into then hopefully
Hmm.
reduce that breakdown in form is to just push past it without going too far, obviously.
Yes, yes, of course. If we just run 1 mile every single run and we don't progress that, 2 miles is always going to feel really tough. But if we just slowly progress little by little by little and overload ourselves, then we're going to end up adapting to that distance.
Love it. Okay, well, that's our final question here. So I just want to, as we wrap up, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to educate us today. For everyone else who joined on to watch the fireside chat, I always tell everyone I do these selfishly, of seeing what information I can learn from other people and to take in and make myself better. But I appreciate you taking the time. Um, anything else that you want to share with anyone? Any other tidbits of advice or thoughts in terms of your services?
I just appreciate the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about this stuff for hours upon hours upon hours. So I just appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, if anyone does have any questions, just don't hesitate to reach out, email me, anything of that nature. Follow me on Instagram, message me there. Anything. Feel free to ask questions because I love answering questions and I love sharing that passion of running and endurance. So
Yeah, well, we appreciate it. Everyone stay tuned. I'll be sending out the replay tomorrow at 11. Yeah, like you said, if any questions, connect with him directly or feel free to reach out to me and I can get you guys connected. But Matt, thanks for joining us tonight. And I hope everyone here has a great rest of your week.
thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, everyone.